Hi, everybody. My name is Andrea Coomber. It's my great privilege to be the Chief Executive of the Howard League for Penal Reform. I'd like to thank you for joining us for this Spotlights event to mark International Women's Day tomorrow. Spotlights is a series, and it's part of our commitment to lift the lid on what's happening in prisons and to build better public understanding of the need for penal reform. A few quick matters that Katie's just put in the chat, though. Just to say, the event is being recorded. It will be posted on our YouTube channel, and we've had 180 people sign up. They won't all be able to attend, so it allows them to catch up. We'll begin with a brief chat with the panelists, followed by the opportunity for audience members to ask questions. Please put your questions into the Q&A box rather than into the chat, but use the chat to introduce yourself as you see fit. And finally, we will run out of time. We always do with questions, so please do put your questions in early to ensure you get considered. And finally, it's entirely possible that today's event will cover some unpleasant, upsetting territory, so please bear that in mind. We'll try to issue trigger warnings where that's possible, but I think you can brace yourself for some sad content. Speaking of which, before we start, I want to just say something about the very shocking report earlier this week from the Inspectorate about HMYOI Wetherby, which came out on Tuesday. This is a youth offenders institution in Yorkshire that holds around 160 boys, and at the time of the inspection last December held 3 girls. The report makes really grim reading on many levels. A low light for me was the fact that pain-inducing restraint had been used on 9 occasions in the previous 12 months. And on every single occasion, the Independent Restraint Review Panel found that they'd been inappropriately used. There's also dreadful stuff in there about use of force, about lack of regime for many of the children, some of them spending 23.5 hours a day in their cells. But the thing that caught the headlines was that there was a girl who on 2 occasions was stripped by teams of all male officers in order to stop her self-harming. This is a disgraceful incident, not at all isolated, and it highlights really why boys' prisons are not a safe place for girls. The Howard League's consistently opposed the placement of girls into Wetherby, and I've raised it in every single meeting I've had with a prisons minister over my 2.5 years at the Howard League, with 5 different prisons ministers in 2 and a bit years. Through our amazing advice line, we've heard from lots of girls in Wetherby over time since they started to be placed there, and none of it is good. Our very strong view is that prison's no place for any child, boys or girls, who'd be much better served in other secure settings. And with nearly half the children in the estate on remand, we really need to think about whether or not those kids need to be in custody at all. Obviously, a boys' prison is no place for a girl, and the report makes that clear. On Tuesday, we launched a campaign to get girls out of Wetherby, and I very much hope that you'll sign our petition and that you'll share it widely. I have a meeting. I wrote to the Secretary of State yesterday, and I have a meeting with the Prisons Minister next Tuesday to discuss the removal of girls from Wetherby. The more signatures we have, the more our hand is strengthened to encourage them to do the right thing. It's been nearly 3 years since girls were taken out of Rainsbrook, and the Ministry of Justice has failed to come up with a proper plan for girls. And they've failed, and girls are paying the price. So I really hope you'll lend your support. To today's event, well, last Friday, in addition to 7 girls, there were 3,664 women in prisons in England and Wales. That's a more than 10% rise on this time last year, and more than twice as many women as were in prison 30 years ago. It's been 15 years since Baroness Corston declared that there was no area of public policy where there was such an abundance of evidence of something not working, and yet pursuit of policy against good evidence as with respect to imprisonment of women. The Corston report powerfully put the case for fewer women in custody. And while that hasn't happened, despite a female offender strategy and lots of initiatives, the report has highlighted the needs and firmly put women in prison on the agenda. We now know and understand the reasons why women end up in prison are often complex, and that going through the criminal justice gateway invariably makes things worse rather than better for them. Worldwide, the population of women in prison is growing, and in this country, where we're locking up more and more people all the time, women's incarceration rates are higher than they are for men. And at a time when we have more people on remand than ever before, again, the proportion of women on remand is increasing at a higher rate. Today we're going to explore what all of that means for the prison estate and for the women who live in prison, their families and communities, and what we need to do to think about in respect of women in prison as we mark International Women's Day. I am really delighted, I'm always delighted to speak to our guests at Spotlights events, but really are they a panel of close and old friends, and amongst their own personal achievements. Today's panelists all happen to be girlfriends of mine. So I'm really happy, I'm extra excited to have them here. They are Jules Rowan, who is the host of the Life After Prison podcast, amongst other shows on National Prison Radio. And I've known Jules since she used to train me at my local Virgin A 2 years ago, when neither of us knew what we were doing for jobs or where we'd been. Next, we have Paula Harriott, who describes herself as a former prisoner mum and head of prison engagement at Prison Reform Trust. She also hosts a wonderful Secret Life of Prisons podcast. And finally, Sonia Ruparel, who is a loser who does not have her own podcast, but is the chief executive of Women in Prison and not at all a loser. Sonia is the chief exec of Women in Prison, and I'm really thrilled to have all three of you here. So thanks for joining me today and for being willing to share your experiences. I wondered if we could start by you introducing yourselves and then taking a couple of minutes to share what you think the audience need to understand about the lives, prospects and politics of women in prison. Paula, can we start with you?
We can. Hello, everybody. So, Paula, Andrea's introduced me already. Sharing what I suppose on International Women's Day, why I wanted to come today of all days is because it took me back to remembering really what my personal experience of being in prison was. And I think just to start with that, I don't really love doing like whole trauma porn narratives around how desperate it was, because I feel like that somehow disables me to speak in professional settings sometimes. But I think I want to honor my own personal experience and honor the experience of all the other women that I consistently meet post my release from prison, because in my work I go back into prisons continually. But I'm also friends with some of those women that I shared my sentence with to this day and keep in touch with them because we connected in such a deep and painful experience that I think it's hard to find anybody else really who can deeply relate to it. So I think I just want to start with how deep and painful an experience of going to prison as a mum is. And I put mum in my introduction because being a mum and being separated from my kids, my 5 year, for 4 years from my 5 children, it was probably the deepest, most scarring experience of my life. And I think it's really immensely hard to recover from. And I came out of prison in 2008. I'm still recovering from it, and my family are still recovering from it. So I think I want to point out that it's such a grave decision to send a mum to jail, because the impact is not the prison sentence, it's the impact on the destruction of the relationships and the pain of rebuilding them with zero support and zero insight and zero guidance about how do you recover from that. Who do you go to ask for help? Where's the flag bearers who have illuminated the path for us to say, well, this is what you do in this situation? It's all a journey for me, it was a total journey of self-discovery, like plotting out a path forward for me and my children to heal from that. And probation was zero help. In prison, I was never even asked about my children.
Wow.
And I think that you're seen as a number to be processed through the system. And even to this day, I don't think there's sufficient emphasis on the pain of separation as a mum, even a grandmother. You know, I met women just recently in a women's prison who were grandmothers who were talking about missing their grandchildren so immensely. And, you know, and not having an opportunity to, how do you retrieve that role? For me, 4 years away from my children, I, I was supplanted as a mother figure. Thank God that other people stepped into those roles, and friends and family. But I came home to not knowing, how did I retrieve that role as a mum? How did I ever get my children's forgiveness? How did I ever rebuild those broken relationships? And how did I cope with the guilt of it all as well? The guilt of knowing that I'd caused so much pain. I think it was like those are, in essence, on International Women's Day, just want to say that these are the things that we do to women when we separate them from their children, that we essentially sentence them to a lifetime of guilt, a lifetime of pain, um, and we don't. There isn't any sort of, like, on top of that, there's no societal forgiveness either for the prison sentence that you, even to this day, look, from 2008 I was released, my sentence finished 2012. I'm still forced to declare my conviction. I'm still um, nervous when I meet new people outside of the criminal justice sector about how they will respond to me. What are
Yeah.
they really thinking about me? How do they take me? Like, when I feel continually judged, and I feel continually nervous when I meet new people about whether or not I can trust in their friendship or their support for me, because I wonder deep down if they have attitudes or moral frameworks that situate me and position me outside of them. And that's a really difficult place to build new relationships and move on. So.
Jules, thank you, Paula. You got me almost crying. We've only just started.
No,
Oh, honestly, it's what you do to
it's
me all the
deep.
time.
It's a deep.
It is.
It's
It
deep.
is.
It's deep.
I mean, the trigger warning at the beginning was mostly for me. Jules, we'll go to you. I mean, you were a kid, really. You were a young adult when you went to prison.
I'm still a kid. No, I'm joking.
You look like
yeah,
one. You put a cap on you, and you look like you're 12.
yeah, probably. But no, you're right. I was young when I went to prison. So my offense was for GBH. It was a nightclub fight that just escalated and definitely shouldn't have happened. It was never supposed to happen. So just unfortunately, events took place that night. So I was 20 when I went to prison. I got 5 years. So yeah, I was young. But I think at that time I was just like, I just needed to think about what the hell's going on. It was just wasn't supposed to kind of happen in my world. So I think I grew up quite quickly, because the other route that I had was to keep messing about and be around other young people in prison and kind of go down this road. And I quickly kind of understood in prison that it is all about how you use your time. Obviously, and it's not easy in there. So it's how are you going to survive, basically. And you can survive by doing everything that you kind of know young people can do. Out here and in there, they do it, bad stuff. Or I can focus on how to better myself and get out and actually be successful when I got out. And it was tough. It was really tough to do that, because people kind of just I don't know, you've got to be quite strong-minded to do that. And obviously the way the system is run, it's not really kind of I managed to, get qualifications and better myself and come out a better person. But the majority of people in there don't do that, don't get to do that, because it's not easy to do.
Yeah.
So yeah, with a lot of hard work and determination and a massive family support and just, yeah, willpower, I did manage to better myself and come out a much better, and I like to say, on a great path. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. And now, so I managed to get my qualifications inside my level 3 personal trainer, which allowed me to be a PT when I got out. And again, level 3 PT is really hard to find in there. And I think I managed to find a prison that did do it. And now I host a podcast called Life After Prison, which is incredible. But what I saw in there, the main things were, people not having that support and not having confidence and not having determination and not having self-belief, and it becomes this downward spiral that majority of the people do go down. I don't know where I got it from. I don't know what happened to me, but I literally turned the other way. But yeah,
I mean, I
it's sad.
suspect International Women's Day events across the country, across the planet over this week are going to talk about women and confidence and believing in themselves. And I think they're really common themes of
Yeah.
discussions around International Women's Day. But we're talking now about a group of women who bring with them shame and disappointment and feeling like they've let people down and they've let themselves, all of that. I mean, it seems to me to be just a million times worse. I just can't imagine a context really where women would be so marginalized and feel so. I mean, you see that when you go to prison. Like, women are broke. They're
And I
broken
think
women.
I think also the stigma against, women going to prison, it makes it more of a subject you don't want to discuss or tell anybody when you get out of prison. So,
Yeah.
you're in prison with women, so you're like, hey, this is I'm not on my own here. This is kind of normal in a really weird way. And then when you get out, it's like women don't go to prison. You shouldn't be in prison. It's not feminine. It's not
Well, it's
this.
not ladylike, is it?
It's
Like,
not really, is it?
no.
Well,
No.
but
I
like,
mean,
And
that's the ridiculous
that's
thing.
what makes it so difficult
yeah,
coming out of prison, is that you're contending with that all the time, aren't you? That's what I said, like, when do you tell your neighbor? When do you tell, if you move house, when do you tell when do you tell the neighbor that you may have been to prison when
I mean,
you're
I was there
going
when
down for a
Jules told
drink?
our whole gym,
Yeah,
and I just stood there shaking my head, thinking, "Oh my God, you're kidding! She's been to prison, and I'm bloody director of the Howard League, and we never known this about each other. It's crazy."
that's right. And
Um.
it's really hard to talk about it. The stigma is really
Oh
hard to
yeah. I
work
mean,
through.
I
It's
really felt for Jules
frightening.
at the time.
And I think what happens is that because of that stigma, women who've been to prison, like, stick to their own and are frightened to move out of the space. Like, they're sort of stuck in a cycle sometimes, or a circle, because that feels normal and comfortable, and moving beyond that is scary. It is scary. And so the whole thing is scary, from the day the handcuffs go on you, to the day you get in the van, to the day you go to the cell, that you're strip searched when you get into prison, when you're um, uh, putting on the prison greys, when you're eating the prison food out of the blue cup and the plastic plates. And it's all, for me, the shock of it, knowing, thinking before, I didn't really know what to expect. I'd never been to prison before. And you think, well, surely it's going to be a bit like a hospital or something. It's going to be there's going to be this sort of notion of care, that people are going to care for you. And you get there, and it's uniforms and abruptness and numbers and depersonalization and being told to line up. And yes, I knew I was being punished for the crime. I didn't know the punishment would be the treatment. I didn't know it would extend to the treatment and the
Well, it's
harsh
not meant to,
conviction.
Paula.
Yeah,
Like,
but I don't, like, that's what it is. That's how I
yeah, it is.
experienced it. Poor quality food, where things are done to you. They're not explained what's happening. You're expected to be on a conveyor belt of just going through the sentence, and nobody sits and explains it to you, and it's like a very isolating experience, and very, you know, doubles down on that feeling that you are shit, you are like no good, because this is the decisions that you made, this has led you to come to prison, you're individually
This is what you deserve.
you've got what you deserved, and then it's sort of pile on, right?
Yeah.
And it took me, so I was in prison for 4 years. It took me, I would absolutely say it took me about 2 years to suddenly work out, actually, there's a sort of like ways in which society has created this as well, these systems. And these systems are placing all the responsibility on me. But actually, I was asking for help. There were 9 services that were in my life before I went to prison. And can I tell you, Sonia, that it was women in prison, that it was the organisation Women in Prison. They had a worker who came into the prison where I was. And it was the very first time that I experienced like non-judgmental kindness that was based in a political analysis of oppression, and was feminist in the way that the woman, her name was Jane, dealt with the women that she met, and me included. And we came through her interaction with her, we were exposed to a new and broader understandings of how women end up in prison. So, you know, like the circumstances by which women come into prison, and the systemic drivers for that. It was Jane from Women in Prison. I'd like to see her again one day. And she actually sort of brought that knowledge to us as a group of people. And that's why now my work is so much about rights-based advocacy, because what's missing, and even today, what's missing is what rights do women in prison have? How can we advocate for them, but how can we enable them to speak for themselves with the knowledge that Women in Prison, the Women in Prison worker, brought to me that day, that changed my life.
Sonia, let's bring you in to talk a bit about, I mean, you're relatively new to this space. Like, what have you seen done? I mean, how much does what Paula and Jules mentioned resonate with what you see on a daily basis?
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing your stories. It really resonates with, you know, just everything that we see on a daily basis. And thank you, Paula, for sharing that story about women in prison as well. I'm really proud to work for an organisation that really does support women in that way. The rights thing is really interesting. What do I see in this space? I sometimes do feel like I'm back in a humanitarian situation where women's basic dignity and rights have gone. When don't have trousers, when they don't have toothbrushes. I mean, they don't have information to know how to access those things at a very basic level without even thinking about, well, have they got access to their health and their meds and everything. So it feels an extraordinary space and inexcusable in a country which is like the 6th wealthiest in the world, that we treat women with so little dignity and so little respect. And you know, your stories are really resonant. Yesterday I was talking to someone for another International Women's Day event, and it just resonates with all the stories. I mean, she had 8 bereavements in a very short space of time and turned to abusing alcohol, and then became homeless. And when she was looking for somewhere to sleep, ended up being picked up by the police and then hitting them, and then got 6 years in prison. And I said to her, well, you know, what would have prevented this from happening? She said, I just needed somewhere to live, you know. So this is a basic right. You have a basic right to shelter, to housing. So it is fairly extraordinary that we are criminalizing women for being homeless, for being poor, for experiencing domestic abuse, for being on drugs. And rather than supporting them in the communities, with their families, with those around them that they love and can actually care for them. I think that's, you know, your point, Paula, about care is so true. prison estate doesn't care for people in that way, that's where they should be. Not in prison, where, and both of your stories were so powerful in that you just think, how do you recover from that? What is the rehabilitation? What is that kind of, how does it prevent reoffending? I mean, it doesn't work as a solution to kind of reducing offending, and we know that it's structural. We know that the structural injustice drives this kind of offending, but I don't feel like the system is tackling that in the right places. So yeah, it's very, very resonant for what we see all the time in prisons.
I mean, I think it's worth noting that all of the things so far really that have been described are things that have got a massive evidence base, like for all of these things, contact with services, drugs and alcohol support, all these mental health support, all of these things, there's just an abundance of evidence about it. Longer sentences for people who assault emergency workers, which is a recent-ish addition from this government, particular sentencing regime around that, has resulted in mass incarceration of women, because it's women who end up calling the emergency workers and end up finding themselves in moments of stress, pushing people and assaulting them and getting extraordinary sentences when really they need help and support. So yeah, I mean, one of the things I did an interview this morning with BBC on mental health and self-harm and suicides of women in prisons, which was incredibly upsetting, obviously. A big piece that they're doing comes out in a couple of weeks' time. But I thought, the mental health, we know that self-harm is just completely sort of at epidemic proportions now, in prisons generally, but particularly in the women's estate. And there've been like a number of suicides in the past year, self-inflicted deaths, of really vulnerable women, of women on remand, women in first nights. And yet there doesn't seem to be the support for them. I wonder if any of you have thoughts about mental health and, to the extent you saw poor mental health. I mean, I see it every time I go to a women's prison. Or what sort of support was available or should be available?
I'll jump in there. I think that in my time in prison, I saw women who absolutely shouldn't have been in prison at all, because they were so seriously mentally unwell that it was painful. I can remember one of the times in prison that there was a lady who had committed arson, and she was years over tariff for release. Because of her mental health, she couldn't comply with the regime, so she was consistently being in trouble. And we as a group of women used to try and help her so that she wouldn't get into trouble, because we knew she was unwell and incapable of complying with the regime. So she wouldn't make her bed, for instance, or she wouldn't wash, or she wouldn't, clean her room. And all these things can mean you can go and report and be adjudicated and sent down the segregation unit. And probably one of the most traumatic things that I witnessed in prison was this young woman who was clearly unwell. We all knew she was unwell. She had failed to do something, and she was being held face down and carried by 6 officers face down to the segregation unit, screaming, "Please don't take me there, please don't take me there, please don't take me there." And it was one of the moments when I felt so powerless as a citizen, because I stood and watched it and wanted to say something and wanted to intervene, but knew that I couldn't, because I would get into trouble and I wouldn't be able to see my kids. And this is the sort of it's like a pivotal moment in my life, because it was the one moment that I saw how you don't have rights in prison, because
the power disparity is just enormous.
You don't have the power to protest. You don't have the power to speak out. And that's why we need organisations to speak. And that's not to speak for, but to speak with us, to amplify what we're saying, because we don't have the power to reach out. You are restricted on what you can say because of the sentence and the grip that it has on you, and also your own, your fear of coming up against that system and having the same fate as that lady did. So mental health is a massive issue. Women, but prison is an institution that also instigates and that
Sure.
augments pre-exist. If you weren't mentally, you can become mentally unwell in prison just by virtue of being sentenced.
Yeah.
Do you know
It's
what
a
I mean?
terrible
Like
place to deal with people with prison.
the fear that I felt on the first day or two, and I'm a strong, capable person, but I felt like intimidated and scared and think, oh my God, like what's going to happen to me? And you imagine if you're already like, I've seen women going off their heads, scratching themselves to bits because they're detoxing from heroin. I've seen women I never saw self-harm on the scale that I saw it in prison. When you go to the dinner hall and you see women who've cut their faces, like actually cut their faces, not even their arms or places on their body that they could hide, but on their faces. And these are they're sort of forms of their manifestations of deep pain.
Yeah.
And it's like nobody's got the time to support. And who does a lot of the support is the women in prison themselves, the women who work for the Samaritans, who are listeners, who on top of navigating their own pain try to like reach out and hold and contain other people's pain.
Yeah.
And like there are, and I'm not saying there aren't staff who care, because there genuinely are staff who care. There are people who are angels in those spaces, who come into those spaces and don't get caught up in the negative culture and really reach out and try to hold people. But there's not enough of those people, and there aren't just enough staff in general. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of moral blindness. I call it moral blindness, where deep down there are people who work in those spaces who actually judge the women and think they deserve the punishment, and that causes a blindness to some of the neglect, lack of care, vindictiveness, lack of concern for delivering a high quality public service. It's like a moral blindness that comes over them because they're imbued with the narrative of these are awful women and it doesn't really matter what happens to them because they're troublesome, complex, argumentative,
Yeah.
lost causes.
And Jules, you obviously have a podcast about life after prison. I mean, what sort of particular challenges do you see for women coming out? I mean, Paula said just come out to nothing, and we know women come out to homelessness, for example, in huge numbers. But
I think there is so many challenges for women in prison, and obviously getting out of prison. Just to touch on inside prison as well, I think a massive reason for mental health being so bad and spiraling downwards is, the exercise, the food. These are all massive things that people need out here. And because mental health is so low in there, there's no motivation to go to the gym and to exercise and to eat well, no education in what they're eating, but they're also being given the food that isn't going to benefit them, and then their mental health goes downwards as well. So I think especially for the women compared to the men, so the men are, they're at the gym all the time,
a big part of culture for men.
Yeah, it's massive. And it's so the opposite for women. And I was in 4 different prisons during my time. And every single prison I was in, the percentage of women that actually exercised and ate well was so small. And I think that should just be embedded in the culture a little bit more. The women need a little bit more motivation, a little bit more information about why this is going to help them, and how they can do it, because a lot of men probably know how to train as well. I don't know. They're that kind of character in the gym, and women not maybe as much. And it's growing, and I think that's fantastic. But I think that would be massive for women inside, and also for women outside as well. But I think, for women coming out as well, being able to be back with their children, housing, building a fundament, like building a family and having those fundamentals are a problem for women. I mean, if they don't have housing, how are they going to show that they can look after their children? And I think that is so big, and it just ruins their whole kind of plans to rebuild those ties. Men Confidence again. I think confidence is massive when you're coming out. You haven't been able to do the work inside, so you come out, and it's so scary coming out. People think that it's just going in, but I mean, this is why we do what we do on the podcast. So I'm a massive advocate for people that have been in prison, but especially women. I have a co-host called Zach, and we have a podcast called Life After Prison, where we speak to people who've been affected by the criminal justice system, or not. It's kind of reaching more and more people now, people that work in the sector, people that are just interested, but mainly it's there to help the people that have been affected by the criminal justice system, because when you get out, there isn't that help. And there's nowhere to kind of really turn to. And when you get out, it's kind of just like, just it's a lot. It's a lot to deal with. So yeah, that's there for the help. And we also, so we sit down with people, we have these conversations, long form conversations, and we also have other episodes that help you with kind of information, advice, guidance when you first get out. Like, how do I disclose my conviction, and how do I open a bank account, etc. And I think disclosing the conviction's a massive one as well. That stigma around women going to prison, and people in general going to prison. It's not just women, but women especially, I think now, it just does not look good. Especially, like, for example, if you take me, I was 20, I got a 5-year sentence for GBH. It just doesn't look good at all. And I have to live with that and have that next to my name. And like Paula said earlier, it doesn't go, especially with our sentences, because they were over 4 years. We will always have to declare that. And there's no running from that. And there's no hiding from that. It's just there with you all the time. And I think the rules around spent and unspent convictions as well would help a lot of people if we could just kind of monitor that attachment and that stigma that we have to carry for the rest of our lives. But
I mean, I think the stigma thing is, I think, even just an impediment for in our space of kind of penal reform. I mean, I think, you know, we're lucky to have voices like Paula's voice and your voice, Jules, but there are hundreds of thousands of people in this country who've been to prison, and the stigma when they come out is such that they pretend they haven't been to, they don't disclose that to.
That's the thing. So,
and then that just spirals on.
Well,
so it becomes, and I understand why.
The guidance is, you know, the guidance, what has been around family and friends, not everybody, but this was, you know, what I was kind of told, you know, family, friends say, you know, it doesn't look good. Employers, don't tell your clients or whatever, doesn't look good. You know, people judge, which is so true. But what it does, that stopped me from speaking about it and actually being able to talk about it. So like you said at the start, when I told everybody that time, like, I had clients for a couple of years that I was dying at some points to say, you know, this is where I became passionate about fitness. Like, because they'd say, like, where did this passion come from? And I'd want to say, you know, look, I spent time in prison. It gave me a lot of time to think about what I wanted from life, and, you know, my mistakes and all of these kind of things. And really, in the back of my head, I was just struggling because I couldn't speak about it. So I think that's the other thing. It's allowing women to be honest and truthful and express that they've been through this trauma or whatever they've been
I mean,
through.
we spend so much time in workplaces talking about people bringing their whole selves to work, you know, whether that's sexuality or opinions or, you know, whatever. And yet this is an area where people are told to, like, you know, whatever you do, don't. I mean, when we recruit people in prison, we recruit at the Howard League, we always encourage people to, like, you know, if you, like, we see it as a positively good thing if you've been to prison. Obviously, we're a penal reform organisation, but it's really important to us that people bring those experiences to work, and it's also really useful. Like, I mean, our people who've been to prison are particularly helpful on various sort of aspects of policy and stuff. But no, it's incredibly, the stigma has lots of manifestations. We have a lot of questions to answer.
Sorry, could I just come back on that?
Yeah,
very
sure,
quickly?
Paula.
Yeah,
while I
just
look
to
at the
say that thinking about coming out essentially as a person with convictions, you know, I was forced out. I didn't come out willingly. So when I was in prison, in my last year of prison, I used to go out on release on temporary license to work at an organisation as a volunteer. And I was really proud to do that, really excited to do that. And then one day, the Sun followed me and published the most awful picture of me where I looked absolutely dreadful.
We're all going to have to Google that now, Paula.
Yeah. And it said, the headline was, "Drug lag let out to work in drugs rife Handsworth." And a spurious story about how they followed me and I went to meet this black man in a blacked out car in my lunch break. It was actually my son, who's actually of mixed heritage, and you know, and had come to see me at his lunch break from work. But it forced me out. Yeah. And like, I think there's something about the public, that the way newspapers publish these stories about women in prison to demonize them, and that meant I couldn't ever pretend I hadn't.
Yeah.
Because it was Googled. Any job I went to, people were Googled.
Yeah, but the choice was taken away from you.
So it, you know, there's also this like thing that we're fascinated by these women who've been to prison, and we like to put them in the papers, and people read that shit. Yeah. And that's why I started my talk by saying I actually like quite often shy away from doing stories about who I am and my situation, because of like, I don't want to feed this fascination with the pain. I want to deal with like, who's responsible for fixing it, right? Who's responsible for fixing the fact that women go to prison consistently when they could be, you know, I could have been prevented from going to prison. I was using drugs. I was in drug services. I was, you know, what if I'd been diverted to a women's centre? What if I'd been diverted to help that was like proper the very first time I was caught by the police? Yeah, not getting the 8-year sentence right when it was like really serious. What if the services had really engaged with me? What if they'd understood what I needed? I remember the social worker coming to my house one day after some big drama in the house, and it was all a mess, and I was saying, she said, "Oh, I've come to help you, Paula." And she said, what do you need? And I said, "I actually need you to help me hoover now, and help like pick up all the stuff on the floor, so that when my kids come home from school, there's going to be no evidence of this big episode. It's going to be calm." And she said, "That's not in my job description, Paula." And I just look at that and say, it's not in your job description, but you're paid to help me. But on whose terms are you helping me? You're not helping me with what I need right now. You're not hearing me right now. What if she'd actually done that day? And maybe then my life would have taken a different turn, you know, who knows? But I do also think those are moments when I look back and think, well, that was the day I realized that statutory services like social services, they can't help you. They can't help you. They help you only if you follow their program.
Yeah, if you need what they're offering.
Yes, there you go. And I think
And
it's about, you know, we as services need to listen more deeply to the women and like come at them with what they need. And I think women in prison, that Jane, her name was, I go back to her. I remember her coming into the prison and listening and trying to build relationships, right, and offering actual proper help that the girls needed. So that's the time.
Sorry, Paul, we're gonna have to go into some questions.
Sorry.
So the question here from Nikita, saying research says most women offenders are victims first. In your experience, how successful have restorative justice practices been in addressing the unique challenges? Sonia, is that something that women in prison look to? Yes, RJ.
No, not really. You probably know more about this, Andrea, than I do. around restorative justice practices, but I think, you know, so many are victims. I think that's like really clear when I think it's about 70% of women who are in prison are kind of have experienced or are experiencing domestic abuse. So many have come through the care system. So many it's because they've experienced homelessness and poverty. So there is that kind of like powerful narrative. And yeah, it's just not properly addressed in the way that they are dealt with and sentenced and looked at. So I think that's really important.
Yeah. There's another question here about, I mean, it's a terrible story. I'm just going to briefly say, I mean, Yvonne Simpson said that she was told that her son had Down syndrome when she was in Style after a scan and had to wait 4 weeks for an outside appointment after she'd been told he was fine. And the whole time she was advised to have an abortion. And she's now writing a book about the experience of giving birth in prison and leaving kids behind. So we wish you well, Yvonne, with your book, and we look forward to reading it. But we do have a real problem about pregnancy. I mean, there are lots of other countries where women who are pregnant are not in prison, and ours is not one of those countries. I was in a women's prison last summer, and a woman arrived that day. She was 8 months pregnant, and she'd been remanded for burglary. And you're thinking, and the prison governor was saying, what am I meant to do with her? How do I keep her and her baby safe? Like, it was, you know, who decided that this was a safe place to bring an 8-month pregnant teenage girl? I mean, we know that there have been terrible instances of children, of babies dying in utero, or like at birth, and the trauma that causes for their mums. So yeah, we look forward to your book, Yvonne. Yeah. There's a question here from Nikita, Jules, perhaps for you, saying what policies can be employed to promote better quality of life for women post-release? I mean, there are a couple of things that you would think would make a difference, like a real difference.
Yeah, I mean, it is a really good question. I think there's another really good question about like things that could be done inside as well. And I think maybe they might overlap in a way. I'm always really passionate about people kind of thinking about what they want to do and going for that, thinking about what they're interested in, their passions, what they could do in a job. All of these there's so much variety out there.
You asked that when you went into prison. Did anyone ever sit down with you and say, hey, 20
what do I want to be when I grow up?
Yeah, what do you want to know?
No, but
this is tell me that now does happen. Although I'm not sure I've seen any.
Really?
Apparently, it's meant to happen.
This is where I'm going along the lines, and I want to kind of I want to kind of answer this one of like outside. Sure. But the reason why I'm saying this is because, you know, when I was getting my level 3 inside and I got to open prison and I could do outwork, every kind of there was like 5 kind of places that the prisoners could do work, and they had ties with the prisons, and that kind of wouldn't change. So I really wanted to try and be in a gym, and oh my God, absolutely impossible. Like I don't know how I landed in a David Lloyd once a week, but that is so unheard of. I had to get so much. It was actually due to another prisoner before me sending out 50 emails to different gyms, getting an okay. And the prison basically didn't want it to happen. And one of the prison officers that were really helping me throughout that year, he had to put in like all this massive stuff. So I had no idea even I could be a PT when I got out. So like giving people these understanding that how many different opportunities and that they can do it if they want to run their own business, they want to do that. Like this, I think helping women build confidence, helping build women confidence in exercise and training, understanding the benefits of how that can help you, and in work and in hobbies, because these are the kind of places that people gain confidence in themselves and relationships with other people. And if you're not able to get into these spaces for whatever reason, you're not going to be able to you're not going to be able to flourish. You're not going to be able to get this. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And people just need that help and that guidance. And unfortunately, there just isn't that point of contact when you get out. There isn't that person or these people that get you in these spaces. And obviously we're trying to get probation, you know, working a little bit better. Like that would be amazing, but it's just not there. It's just there.
There's
So,
a great comment in the Q&A from William. William, thank you for joining us today. You're one of a handful of men on this particular podcast episode of Spotlight. He says that he was employed as a prison officer at a Category B men's prison for 18 months over the past 2 years, and we raised what mental health support is there, and he agrees that there's a shocking failure of provision. He said when he was trained, he was told he'd be a personal officer for a certain number of prisoners, and he'd have time to meet with them individually as part of his work, and he chased that up but never found the time. I mean, I hear this a lot when I go to prisons, and prison officers are saying, this is not what I signed up for. I'm just locking people behind their cell doors. I wanted to engage with them. And, you know, I wonder if that, I mean, obviously William sounds like he's very frustrated, but asks like how much of a problem it is, how much of a problem is it when we can't link the people who need support with the staff who want to do it, but like they've got their prison officer required operational barrier. Is that something, Jules, you're smiling? Sonia?
I was just gonna make a small comment, but I think I mean, obviously that's so deeply frustrating. I can imagine when you're trying to do good in a system that is not set up to enable you to do it in any way is despicable. And you know, you still hear stories of women being locked up for 23 hours just because there aren't enough staff to even let them out their cells, let alone provide the actual support that they need while they're there in the kind of mental health and everything. And I just wanted to comment on the mental health conversation. I know we moved along, but I don't think a lot of people know that women are sent to prison as a place of safety. So they won't even have committed an offence, and they will have gone to prison as a safe place of safety where there is no mental health support for them, and that's exactly the reason that they're there, and there's not enough beds. And I just think that's an indictment on our society. It's not the criminal justice system per se, but it's actually, you know, the fact that there is not enough mental health support, there's not enough public health support for women, that they end up in prison. And as Paula rightly said, that can actually make your mental health so much worse. So it, you know, it does feel like a bit of an impossible job when actually people are sent there because of their mental health, and then you don't have the support there to actually support them through that. Then it feels like it's a slightly hopeless situation for so many of them.
Yeah, I
I
mean,
think,
there's
like,
sorry, Jules. Yeah,
I was just going to add like about what was his name again? Sorry, William said. Like I definitely think it's also a culture thing. So, you know, the culture of how prisons are run and how it's done needs a shift, needs a change, because that shouldn't be like the case. You know, if you're a personal officer that wants to help, like that it should be like one of the one of the core fundamentals of what the prison officer is there. But obviously the prison officer is there to, I think they need to understand exactly what the officer's job role is and what they want from that, because when we don't understand that fully, they're confused, the prisoners are confused, and then there's that massive barrier. The prisoners don't think they care, and the officers are just trying to do their job. So yeah, I think there needs to be, oh sorry,
I've got you back.
I think my signal's gone. Sorry, I was just saying the prisoners are confused, and the officers are just trying to do their job. And I think when everybody understands and there's that shift, I think it can be such a better place. And it's done. There are prisons that run really well. They rehabilitate people, you know, and the crime rate, the people that go back in prison is so low. There just needs to be something done now here.
But we're quickly running out of time. I wonder if I could ask each of you for like a couple of sentences that of hope on International Women's Day. I mean, a lot of what we've talked about has been reasonably miserable, and that's because life in prison for women and for men is pretty miserable. But what gives you hope or makes you reflect in a positive way, I guess. Paula?
That I also met some amazing women in prison, like amazing, strong survivors, you know, like, and I suppose it goes to show, doesn't it, that sometimes I say to myself, you know, that which doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and that there are amidst all the stories of pain, there's also a lot of courage, and there's a lot of grit, and there's a lot of determination, and you know, there's just immense courage to go through that and still to hold yourself upright, because there's parts of those journeys that cripple you. Do you know what I mean, emotionally? And so yeah, like the hope I see now is like more and more emphasis growing around we shouldn't imprison mums. We should consider the impact on children. I think great work by Shona Minson, Sarah Beresford, people like that, who are like campaigning around the rights of children in this space as well. Great hope there that maybe that might be the lever we can utilize. I think that there's sort of great, you know, there's great energy around trying to change it, and there's more and more women who've lived through the experience like coming out to speak about it. So hopefully together we can, you know, really challenge this situation.
Sonia?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. I think the one thing that gives me the most hope is I haven't met one single person in my journey in this role, from government to people working in the space to women, who believe that women should be imprisoned in this way. So the hope is that, you know, there is a female offender strategy. It's not being delivered, but you know, most people that are working in the government do believe in it and do want it to be real and to be realised, and that the women's prison population should like dramatically decrease. So there's hope in the kind of intent. We don't seem to be going about it the right way, but there's real hope there. And there are some, you know, proposals on the table, particularly the one around presumption against short sentences, which we know so many women are in prison for such short amount of time, that if that is done well, there will be a reduction in the women's prison population. So there are some hopeful things, I think, out there that we can also kind of all as individuals and organisations really lean into.
Jules, finally from you.
Just remind me of the question exactly, because
What gives you hope?
What gives me hope for women in prison and for women leaving prison? That women are strong. They can survive just as well and as capable as men. They just need more support. And I think, like you know, Sonia and Paula are saying, there are people working and trying and supporting, and the more we keep, you know, speaking about it and talking about it and wanting change to happen, the more women will get the help. But you know, there are some beautiful moments, and there are some real strength that you see in there, and you come out, like Paula said, and some moments that I can never, you know, I'd never want to get rid of. They were incredible and they're fantastic. So, you know, women are powerful and strong, and I think, you know, in the future, in the near future, hopefully, you know, we can start to make real changes in the system, because it's time. It really is time. But, you know, people are working hard to make that happen. So,
well, I'm given hope by, I mean, like Sonia, I'm hopeful that every single person, like Sonia said, who I talk to, recognises that we shouldn't be locking women up, that we've got imprisonment of women wrong. So I just don't feel like, you know, they'll talk about why that is, that they make the case, even though you think that they wouldn't be making the case because they're not really doing what they should be doing about it. Like, they understand. And we do have this initiative now, as long as the government lives long enough to get the sentencing bill through, that we'll get rid of short sentences. If that's done properly, that will make a massive difference to women proportionately. So that also gives me hope. And finally, I'm given huge hope by people like Paula and Jules, for coming out and speaking and sharing your stories. And Jules, every time I think quite famously, I hate podcasts. I don't really listen to them, but I do listen to yours, and I listen to Paula's now too. But they're the only ones I listen to. But every time I watch one of your and Zach's podcasts, I just think like there are more people who are then coming out of the woodwork and talking about what it's like and sharing with the public, because I think government gets away with really terrible prison policy because this is all happening behind closed bars, and these are nameless, anonymized people who have intentionally been marginalized and forgotten. And your podcast gives them a voice and brings them out and shares their stories. And the public wants and needs to know what actually is happening in prison and who's coming out of prison, and that it's just normal people, just like people in prison are just normal people. Like there's really not any great difference between all of us, and we could all very easily find our way into prison in the worst circumstances. So that's what gives me hope. This medium means that we can't really ask members of the audience to clap to thank our panel, but I intend to clap oh, look at that, Jules doing some hello pup. Thank you for these amazing women.
Did you see?
Yeah, lovely. Look, that's why we have young people on these things, because I'm sure Paula wouldn't know how to do that, and I certainly don't. I can't commend to you enough the Life After Prison podcast for breaking down stigma and building communities, as well as the Secret Life of Prisons podcast, which returns for its new series next Monday. Paula, correct me if I'm wrong. Amongst other things, I'm actually interviewed on that about Bedford Prison and the current state of prisons. So do keep an eye out for those podcasts. If you're not already a member of the Howard League, please do join and lend your power to our voice. We look forward to seeing you at the next Spotlight event. We've got one coming up on the purpose of prison and another one looking at the IPP scandal. And finally, if you haven't already done so, please do sign our petition about girls at Wetherby and encourage others to join our campaign. Thank you again to our panel, one of whom we've just lost. But yeah, hope you all had enjoyed the event and have a lovely afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us.